Forge gang! I am still a heart man. Let's go. All right. So I will go further east to the far Orient. I am leaving behind the Indian subcontinent. I am crossing the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas to the rice paddies of ancient China. Now, here's a fun fact. Most Chinese people call themselves Han after the Han Dynasty, which lasted from 202 BC to about 220 AD or CE. And even though the Han Dynasty fell almost 2,000 years ago, most Chinese still continue to call themselves Han. Even though there has been like a couple of a dozen dynasties after the fall of the Han, but they still call themselves the Han. In fact, in the 1912 revolution, one of the crying mottos for the revolutionaries and Dr. Sun Yat-sen was overthrow the Qing, restore the Ming dynasty being before the Qing. So China is quite different from a lot of other cultures of the ancient world from classical antiquity. It was by far, at least in Eurasia, the most isolated of the ancient civilizations. And although Greece, classical Greece, is actually older than China, China is still very much a very ancient culture. And the Chinese have contributed a bunch of inventions in the ancient and medieval period. The robustness of the culture and how it was able to absolutely shove off foreign cultures, how it was able to absolutely siphon off and assimilate barbarians from the steppe nomads, people in Southeast Asia, just a lot of stuff. The first Chinese dynasty arose in 1700 BC. There's even some scholars that say that the Shui dynasty existed in 2300 BC. And the last dynasty, the Qing, fell in 1912. Just barely over 100 years ago. And it is actually quite incredible how China, not just in ancient times, but even now, has been able to absolutely endure. The first dynasty, 2300 BC, although the archaeology seems to suggest that it was the Shang dynasty in 1600 BC, and the last dynasty fell in 1912. That's well over 1,000 years after the fall of Egypt, Greece, Rome. India also was able to last a very long time, largely intact. But India also assimilated to a degree Islam and some other cultures And also, for very long periods of time, India was divided and fragmented. But India also has survived into the modern period. So, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Babylon, these cultures were assimilated and were not able to retain their ancient classical roots into modern times in the same way that China and to a lesser degree India were able to do. But anyways, enough of that. So welcome. Welcome very much as I go through some of the things about ancient China. So this will be life in ancient China. Yes, China is a younger civilization than Greece. So per the chronology, however, I want to cover Greece when I go into Europe, when I begin to cover the stuff about Europe. So Greece is older than China, chronologically speaking. It is an older civilization than China, although not by much. But the first civilizations, or the first major civilizations, arose in the Near East, the Middle East, and then going further out into Asia. Asia is the cradle, along with Northeast Africa. It is the cradle of civilization. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and China, and to a lesser degree, the Yucatan Peninsula, Mesoamerica, are known as river valley civilizations. You could also include Greece as well, especially the Minoans of Crete, but generally those are the river valley civilizations. Those are where the seed beds and roots of the first civilized cultures could actually take root after the farming revolution. So, anyways, here we go. Life in ancient China. Daily life in ancient China varied greatly depending on whether a person was a noble or a farmer or a man or a woman, rich or poor. Family relationships were highly valued in ancient Chinese culture. The family unit did not consist only of a husband, wife, and children. Instead, several generations often lived together. Growing rice. Rice has been grown in China since Neolithic times, about 6000 BC to be exact. It may have been cultivated as early as the 6000s BCE. Rice grows most easily in standing water. The farmers used a foot-powered pump to bring water from a canal or river to flood the rice field. Rice seedlings were planted by hand, and growing rice was very labor-intensive. The Song discovered a different variety of rice, native to Southeast Asia, worked better for the environment of South China. Life were designed to continue the family line. Elders expected respect, and it was a common practice to pray to and worship one's ancestors. As they do today, the ancient Chinese put their surname first before their personal name, which showed the great importance of the family. So, family and clan ties and lineage was very important in ancient China. Very hierarchical, very tied down communal society. Agriculture. The literature and paintings of ancient China depicted the lives of rulers, and has much information about what daily life was like for commoners, except for the few artifacts uncovered in archaeological digs. Historians know farming played an important role in ancient Chinese society because of tools and pottery found in large village sites near the Huang River. Agriculture was important across different regions of China. More than one half of the crops we eat today originally came from Asia. Those thought to originate in China include millet, chestnut, walnuts, soybeans, Chinese cabbage, some citrus fruits, and many more. Millet, a type of grain, was one of the main crops in ancient China. Rice grew naturally along the Huang River, and was likely harvested as early as 8000 BCE. Starting in the 200s BCE, the Chinese irrigated their crops using canals. In rural areas, daily life centered on farming tasks. Men and women typically each had their own jobs. Men worked the soil with hoes and wooden spades. They tilled the fields, hunted, and fished. The importance of tea. Tea came to China probably from Burma, no later than the early 1st century AD. It was cultivated and prized in China. The ancient Chinese thought tea detoxified the body and gave the drinker energy. During the Tang Dynasty, people consumed tea as a social activity or to relax. Poets drank tea while composing their poetry. Author Lu Xu wrote the first book about tea, translated as Classic of Tea, during the Tang Dynasty. It detailed tea's unique properties and how to properly make tea. Tea was sometimes stored in bamboo tubes, and later, during the Sung Dynasty, it was pressed into bricks for transport. Time cooking, making wine, raising silkworms for silk production, and weaving. In agrarian Chinese society, an ox cart was the most common mode of transportation. An ox pulled a covered two-wheeled cart and helped farmers move agricultural products from rural areas to cities where they could be sold. City life. Many ancient Chinese lived in bustling cities. Cities were centers of government and trade. They were home to government officials, scholars, merchants, and craftsmen. Each dynasty established its own capital for the government. Many dynastic rulers chose Chang'an, now known as Xi'an or Xi'an, a city located in the middle of China. The Western Han, Shu, and Tang dynasties all used Chang'an for their capital. During the Tang dynasty, walls built to keep invaders out surrounded Chang'an. Approximately 1 million people lived in Chang'an. Walls wrapped around most ancient Chinese cities and villages. In fact, in Chinese, the word for city literally means walls and markets. Most cities also housed marketplaces. Items for sale were grouped together, so there were rows selling meat, fish, vegetables, medicines, ready-made clothing, silk, gold, silver, axes, and bridles and saddles. Clothing. The type of clothing a person wore indicated his or her status. Both men and women wore tunics, loose clothing that resembled a long shirt and usually reached the knees. The style depended on the person's place in society. Some wore tunics with pants, whereas others wore floor length robes. The wealthier a person was, the fancier his or her clothing or silk. Most common people wore clothing made of cotton or hemp. Only the wealthy could afford silk clothing. The ancient Chinese dyed clothing with four colors: red, blue, yellow, and green. Foot binding. During the Song dynasty, it became common for young girls, starting from the age of 4 or 6, to wrap their feet in strips of cloth. This made their toes curl up and their feet appear smaller. The girls' own mothers often broke their feet over and over again, wrapping after each time. The breaking made the foot smaller and smaller, bringing the toes closer to the heels and preventing further growth. Girls believed the painful foot binding practice made their feet look dainty, beautiful, and more appealing to men. Girls continued wrapping their feet until approximately the age of 16, but by then their feet were permanently deformed, making walking difficult. The custom may have started in the late Tang dynasty with a concubine wrapping her feet like a dancer. One legend said that it started as early as the Shang dynasty by an empress who had a deformed foot. The practice was banned in 1912. Activities that are still popular today, common pastimes included soccer, card games, and playing with yo-yos. Yes, you heard it right. The yo-yo was actually invented in ancient China. Ancient China is credited with inventing the game of soccer. The sport originated in the Shandong province of eastern China in either the 200s or 100s BCE. Am I coming clear or not? Hold on a second. I'm going to take a look at my bit rate speed here. I don't know if am I coming in clear or not here? Hold on a second. Let me see for myself. Uh, uh, am I coming in clear or not here? Yeah, it looks good. Okay, I don't see any disruption. All right. Ancient China is credited with inventing the game of soccer. The sport originated in the Shandong province of eastern China in the 200s or 100s BCE. The ancient Chinese called the game Kuju. It was played for fun and during military exercises. Playing cards originated in China in the 800s CE. They were made from thick paper 2 inches, 5 centimeters high by 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters wide. Craftsmen printed the cards using wood-cut blocks and then colored them by hand, sometimes with characters from novels. The Chinese invented the Kongzhu, or yo-yo, more than 1,000 years ago. The yo-yos were made of bamboo attached to a string. Skilled Kongzhu players could make the yo-yo do more than 1,000 tricks. The Chinese calendar. Although the ancient Chinese invented many modern pastimes, daily life for many people revolved around farming. Ancient Chinese culture depended on agriculture, and agriculture depended on the calendar. Planting and harvesting activities centered on the solar and lunar cycles recorded in ancient Chinese calendars. In the thousands of years of Chinese history, different dynasties from the Han to the Qin observed the solar and lunar positions and calculated the revolution of the earth around the sun. The ancient Chinese calendar had 12 months in a year and 29 to 30 days in a month, with a total of 354 days. However, every 2 or 3 years a month was added, giving the year 384 or 385 days. The calendar was often reset with each emperor, and regions used it differently. Now, the Chinese government does not reset the calendar based on a new leader. They use the Gregorian calendar, the calendar that is used in the Western world for most time tracking. However, the lunar and solar calendars continue to determine many traditional Chinese holidays. The Chinese New Year. The Chinese New Year, also called the Spring Festival, was based on the lunar calendar. It began in the middle of the 12th month and ended in the middle of the first full moon of the first month. This fell between January 21st and February 21st. It was the most important holiday in ancient China and a time to honor gods and ancestors. Before the celebrations began, the houses needed cleaning to rid them of huyak, huiki, huiki, unfavorable breaths, and to please the gods that inspected the houses. During the celebrations, people offered food and other sacrifices to the gods and ancestors. Scrolls were printed with lucky messages, and children received money from their elders. Firecrackers frightened away evil spirits. Food was and still remains an important part of the celebration. Lantern Festival. The Lantern Festival was the first celebration of the year, celebrated during the first full moon of the Chinese New Year. This festival dates back to the Han Dynasty. People jump over fire to get rid of bad luck and light lanterns after dark. Some of the traditional lanterns include riddles on them, and lanterns shaped like the segments of dragons are used in a dragon dance as part of the festivities. The festival is still celebrated in China today. On New Year's Eve at midnight, families eat traditional round dumplings shaped like the full moon. Another ancient Chinese festival, the Dragon Boat Festival, is still popular today. The festival has its roots in the 300s BC. At the time, a minister named Ku Yuan, had been banished by the emperor. Despite his exile, Ku Yuan wrote poems. Kuo Yuan wrote poems about his love for his country, but he eventually became so distraught he drowned himself. The common people so admired Kuo Yuan, they wanted his drowned body to be respected, not eaten by dragons or fish. So people decorated their boats like other dragons, racing them up and down the river. They beat gongs and drums to scare away the dragons. Burial customs. Ancient Chinese burials were steeped in tradition. Much of what archaeologists know about ancient Chinese culture comes from studying ancient tombs. Chinese built their tombs underground, and some included multiple decorated rooms, particularly those of the Shang dynasty. The wealthy and powerful were buried with many valuable possessions because they believed they would continue in the same social status in the afterlife. Items such as weapons, bells, knives, sculptures, tools, and pottery are common objects modern archaeologists find in tombs. Wine was also placed in tombs so the deceased could hold honorary banquets for the ancestors. Sometimes servants were buried alive in the tombs of royalty as a sacrifice to honor the dead. Empty wine vessels and cups are also often found scattered in the graves. At the end of the funeral, mourners drank the wine and tossed the wine cup into the grave. The mourners paid respect to the dead by leaving objects to place in the grave. All right, so let's see here. I'm not going to actually read all of this shit. I'm just going to go over some of ancient Chinese beliefs. So let's do that. Human sacrifice ended during the Zhou era, but divination continued. At that time, the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven emerged. Heaven was a kind of universal force. Heaven chose the emperor to rule, but it was a moral force. A lot of Far Eastern cultures believe in a balance, or they will talk about balance. If the king or emperor were evil, heaven would send natural disasters as a warning. If the emperor failed to heed the warnings, heaven would withdraw its mandate. Social and political order would break down and there would be a revolution. Heaven would choose somebody else to rule. During the Zhou period in China, there is a class of officials who advised kings and rulers on the right way to behave and also how to carry out rituals. The most important of these was Kong Fuzi, known in the West as Confucius. During his lifetime, the old feudal social and political order was breaking down. Appalled by this state of affairs, Kong Fuzi tried to restore ancient principles. Kong Fuzi, Kong Fuzi taught that everybody should accept their role in life and their duties towards others. Rulers had a duty to be benevolent, while subjects should be respectful and obedient. Children should honor their parents, and everybody should honor their ancestors. Kong Fuzi also believed that rulers should set a good example for the people. Most of all, Kong Fuzi taught consideration for others. At the heart of his teaching was Ren, which is usually translated as goodness or benevolence. Kong Fuzi said, "Do not do to others what you do not want to be done to yourself." Kong Fuzi also taught the importance of courtesy and moderation in all things. Confuzi also taught that women should submit to their fathers when young, to their husbands when married, and to their sons if widowed. Women in China were taught values such as humility, submissiveness, and industry. Confuzi never wrote any books himself, but after his death, his followers collected his sayings and wrote them all down. In the centuries after his death, his philosophy became dominant in China and profoundly influenced its culture for far more than 2,000 years. One disciple of Confuzi was Mengzi. Mengzi lived from 372 to 289 BC. Known in the West as Mencius, he stressed the goodness of human nature. He also emphasized the ruler's duty to look after the well-being of his subjects. Mengzi was opposed by Zuni. He lived from 298 to 238 BC. He believed human nature tended to be evil and must be restrained. Legalism. Not everyone agreed with Confuzi that rulers should rule by example. Legalists believed that rulers should be strict. The ruler's word should be law. Legalists believed that rulers should be fair but firm and unwavering. One of the Chinese states, Xin, followed legalist teaching. The Qin rulers at first shared power with hereditary nobles, but they changed the system so that the parts of their realm were governed by officials appointed by the ruler. They also organized families into groups of 5 or 10 people. The members of each group were made responsible for each other's behavior. Legalists believed that since people are naturally evil, punishments should be severe. The people would be made afraid of breaking the law. They also distrusted merchants and believed that only people who owned or worked on the land were trustworthy. Taoism. Taoism began in China in the Zhou era. Taoists believed in the Tao. Taoists believe in the Tao, which means the way. The Tao is an indescribable force behind nature and all living things. Taoists believe in Wu Wei, or non-action, which means going with the natural flow or way of things, like a stick being carried along on a stream. Taoism also teaches humility and compassion. Taoists worship many different gods. The Zhou period is sometimes called China's formative period because so much of classical Chinese philosophy developed at that time. The Chinese form of divination called Qing was probably developed during the early part of the Zhou era. The idea of yin and yang also appeared during the Zhou dynasty. The ancient Chinese believed that all matter is made of 2 opposite and complementary principles. Yin is feminine, soft, gentle, dark, receptive, yielding, and wet. Yang is masculine, bright, hard, hot, active, dry, and aggressive. Everything is a mixture of these 2 opposites. The ancient Chinese also believed there were 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. During the Zhou period, the Chinese art of acupuncture was invented. All right. I'm not going to cover the history of the dynasties. So, I already covered the philosophy and the religion. Yeah, okay. Okay, I already covered that. Okay, so this is the symbol of yin and yang. Our Western equivalent is good versus evil, but it is very different from the Western world's concept of good and evil. Everything in the universe is supposed to be a mixture of these two polar opposite elements. What's up, Ghost of Niccolo? How are you doing, my man? Forge! What is up, Rick Perry? Rick Perry says, Forge gang! Stay hard! Stay hard or get smelted. Okay, so anyways, ancestor worship was an important part of ancient China. Each family had a household shrine where they burned incense and made offerings. People believed the dead could help the living and prayed to them. The Chinese also believed in ghosts, people who died and had no descendants to care for them or who were neglected by their family. They believed would become ghosts. Society in ancient China. In a Chinese family, the father had authority over his wife and children. Marriages were arranged by parents with the help of go-betweens. However, many wealthy men kept concubines. Children were supposed to be obedient. In China, male heirs were very important as they carried on the family. Girls were valued less than boys, and baby girls were sometimes left outside to die or were drowned. In any case, infant mortality was high. People would have many children, but not all would live to adulthood. Some boys went to school, where they learned the teachings of Confuzi by heart. Confuzi by heart. They also learned calligraphy. Of course, only a minority of boys went to school. Most did not. Instead, they worked in the fields from an early age. Foot binding became common in China during the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty, 960 until 1279. When they were 4 or 5 girls, sometimes they had their feet bound. If that was done, eventually the girls' feet became deformed, so they had difficulty walking. However, lily feet were considered men. In ancient China, the upper class were officials called mandarins. To become a mandarin, you had to pass certain exams. The exams were, in theory, open to almost all men. However, Chinese merchants were held in low esteem. Imperial China produced some great women. Among them were the great women poets Zhuo Tao. Zhuo Tao. She lived from 768 to 831. Yu Xianji lived 844 to 868. Shang Yuan Huan lived from 664 to 710, and Li Shengshao and Li Chengzhao, 1184 to 1084 to 1155, and Liang Hongyu, 1100 to 1135, who was a Chinese woman general. Farming in ancient China. Life in ancient China was hard. Most farmers were poor. They owned chickens and pigs and sometimes an ox or mule. In the north, people grew crops of wheat or millet, while in the south they grew rice. Growing rice was back-breaking labor as the fields had to be irrigated and rice plants were planted by hand. In the 16th century, new crops such as sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts were introduced. Other crops included tea, sugar, and cotton. Ordinary women worked in their homes weaving cotton. On the coast and in China's many rivers, people fished. Cormorants were trained to catch fish, but they had rings or cords around their throats to prevent them from swallowing the catch. Rich people owned vast estates, but they usually rented them out in parcels as parcels of land. Rich people preferred to live in towns and rarely dwelt in the countryside. Food in ancient China. The rich in ancient China ate very well. They ate grains like rice, wheat, and millet. They also ate plenty of meat, including pork, chicken, duck, goose, pheasant, and dog. Vegetables included yams, soybeans, broad beans, and turnips, as well as spring onions and garlic. They also ate plenty of fish. Soup was made with shark fins, bird nest, bear paws, and sea slugs. People drank wine made from rice or millet. They also, of course, drank tea. Poor people ate a boring diet. In the south of China, they ate rice. In the north, they ate wheat in the form of noodles, dumplings, or pancakes. However, famines occurred periodically and they caused great suffering. And sadly, there was a lot of famines in the ancient world. Weapons in ancient China. So, one of the things about China is that it was the first nation in the world, or the first civilization in the world, to invent gunpowder and to actually use firearms as well as crossbows and longbows, and also a type of plated steel armor. They were also the first to invent the Chinese were also the first people to invent this type of iron, cast iron. They invented cast iron as well as paper, woodblock printing, and the compass to boot. Before 600 BC, chariots dominated warfare in China. However, after 600 BC, cavalry began to replace chariots. Furthermore, rulers began to raise large armies of infantry. Peasants were conscripted to provide them. In 500 BC, a general called Sun Tzu wrote a book called The Art of War, which was the world's first military manual. In 400 BC, the crossbow was invented in China. Gunpowder was probably invented around the year 900 AD. It was used for rockets, grenades, and bombs that were placed against the wooden gates of enemy cities. And this is the Great Wall of China. Houses in ancient China. Rich people lived in large wooden houses arranged around a courtyard. Roofs were often of tiles, and were built in a curved shape. However, even in a rich house, there was little furniture, but rich people were very fond of their gardens. Poor people lived in huts and perhaps 2 rooms. Roofs were often thatched, and furniture was very basic, such as wooden benches. And let me just say this. If you think that that is very harsh, wait until I cover the medieval period. Wait until I get to medieval Europe. It is much, much worse. So now I'll go ahead and just kind of quickly go through some of the early dynasties. The history of ancient China in hold on a second. All right, so in 1923 AD in China, there was discovered Synthranthropus, also called the Beijing Man, a more developed version of the Pentanthropus or Pentathrop. The remains of 40 of these were found near Beijing in Zhuokuandian Joyukuodian caves. During World War II, for transportation to the United States for the sake of security, these artifacts mysteriously disappeared. Fortunately, in 1964 AD, in the year, another synthranthropic skull was found in Lantin, 50 kilometers southwest of Xi'an, which allows for more extensive research and confirms its importance as the main player who participated. Synthranthropus existed in China about 800,000 years ago. Neolithic. Basically, the history of the Neolithic in China is evaluated by the Yangshou culture, which existed between 5000 until 3000 BC, whose representatives lived in central Jiangxi. Representatives of this culture, Banpo culture, not far from Sayana, today has turned into an open-air museum. Ancient people from this period had a sedentary lifestyle, raised pigs, goats, sheep, cows, and chickens, and had domestic dogs. They were engaged in hunting and fishing, but they also cultivated land, growing millet and even rice. Since then, the tradition of growing silkworms has been taking place. Typical ceramics with a special ornament are also preserved. Among the many discovered Neolithic sites, it is worth mentioning the Lunshan culture, which existed from 3000 to 2000 BC, since it is a peak of development of the time. It is also the largest territory. Vast areas around the middle path of the Juan, reaching coastal areas in the East China Sea. It is believed that Lunshan inherits and develops its achievements from Yangshou, and thus both form the face of the future Chinese civilization. The era of the 3 dynasties. The subsequent era of the 3 historical dynasties includes the Xia, Shanin, and Zhou. Officially, the period covering 2070 to 221 BC, which began after the reign of the 3 teachers and the 5 rulers. However, when we talk about the date of ancient times, we must note the difference in dates in different sources. So, for example, astronomer Liu Xin gives the years for the dynasty of the Xia 2205 to 1766 BC, and the Bamboo Annals, the fundamental historical treatise on antiquity, gives it from 1989 to 1558 BC. Due to these discrepancies, in 1996, the Chinese government brought together 200 scientists around a special project, Xia Xia Shan Zhou Chronological Project. As a result, in November 2000 of the year, the official date used now when we talk about antiquity was published in the People's Republic. Jia Dynasty, 2070 to 1600 BC. This dynasty is not yet proven to exist, although discoveries related to the late Neolithic Urletis culture and excavations near Annan, Henan started in 1928 and continue to the present, trying to connect open bronze instruments and graves with ancient Chinese historians who spoke about this dynasty. The dynasty is mainly known from historical notes. This period is mainly related to activities of legendary figures. Yu the Great, a mythological cultural hero who received the throne because he managed to control the damage from the flood. According to the official version, there were 17 rulers of this dynasty. The last of them was Jezi. Since he was corrupt, he was replaced by Lord Tan, the father of the Shan dynasty. Shan dynasty 1600 to 1046 BC. Shan dynasty is also called the Shanin, thanks to the people of Yin, who at that time was the main population. The period is characterized by gradual freedom, agriculture in combination with hunting, fishing, and pets. With the growth of material culture and the accumulation of it, and the emergence of more developed economic relations, Xiang managed to create a highly developed civilization. At that time, the foundations of the social and political structure, moral values that formed the identity of the statehood and culture of China appeared. The two main events are the discovery of bronze casting technology and the creation of a pictographic letter called Jiayuan, which is in fact the direct precursor of the Chinese written script. The rulers of the Shang pursued a policy of invasion against neighboring tribes. The throne was inherited by kinship. In capitals, including the city of Anyan, the political and cultural life of the country is concentrated. The emperor was a senior priest and occupied a leading place in the rituals of worship of spirits and ancestors. The rulers were buried with numerous artifacts, weapons, and even living people to serve them in the afterlife. But not all things last forever. Next came the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 221 BC. Zhou dynasty is a very long period in the history of China. It is divided into Western and Eastern Zhou. The decisive system for strengthening Zhou's power was partly the aristocracy's arable land inheritance system, replacing the old system of regional vassal relations. As a rule, the central government transferred about 70 districts to aristocrats and especially relatives of the ruler. Together with the leadership under the command of the aristocrat, there was a small army that guaranteed power and controlled subordinate peoples. The zoning system, which arose from the very beginning as amplifying, gradually led to the collapse of the system. In more remote regions, less and less of these vassals were subordinate to the central government, and therefore for several centuries the regions in these territories have become a completely formal part of Zhou and under the real power of the princes or large aristocrats and landowners. Now, this is kind of getting off topic, but a very similar process to this also happened in Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. And if you look at Japan in the Heian era, the same thing happened. The central government lost power to the aristocrats, and then the aristocrats ultimately lost out to the samurai. So this is probably the first time in world history that you see feudalism or the feudal system actually take form. It actually started first in China. Although you could perhaps say that the first fragmented states were in India or in Mesopotamia. Warring kingdoms of Zhuang Jiangfu. This is the Warring Kingdoms period, 481 to 221 BC. They call this one of the most important periods in the history of China. At that time was formed 7 main regions, and despite the constant struggle for domination, there were quite large state entities in which it was necessary to develop another social and political model different from the one that was before. Hundreds of philosophical schools were formed and had the task of offering the most suitable structure. Confucianism, with its pyramidal model of society and the centralization of the power of the ruler, undoubtedly is the first among them. Confucianism was a rather strict system that professed clear processes of transfer of power between representatives of the aristocracy and built on equally clear social hierarchy. In short, such a system was extremely conservative, but at the same time insisted on preserving virtues and nurturing virtuous or various virtues in people. That is, for example, a ruler could not be virtuous. Among with the doctrine of Mahdi and the Sun is born by Taoism or Fadsa. The law school believed that management, this is the legalist law school which believed that management should be based on punishments and incentives. It was from this school that the reformer Shanyan managed through a completely new structure of society to change the appearance of the Principality of Chen, and actually create the prerequisites for a century for this principality or this kingdom, so that in the end, the state of Qin would unite all of China, and the first total Chinese emperor was the ruler of the state, his name being Shen Huangdi, Chen Huangdi, Chen He Huangdi. It is from this time that the modern history of China begins. Well, imperial China. Oddly enough, that is the history of imperial China, which is a completely separate story. It should be noted that periods such as the beginning of the Silk Road, which connected the East and the West, was the basis of cultural exchange between civilizations. And I'll probably go into and perhaps cover a bit of the Silk Road. So in this segment, or in this historical stream, I will not cover Imperial China, and I'm not going to really cover like a bunch of the history of the dynasties. I just want to give you a rundown on how the Chinese people lived, how they assigned and were organized into classes, how they farmed, what they ate, and the gods and ancestors that they worshipped, and just kind of give you a basic rundown on what exactly is going on in this society. Now, the Chinese classics include the works of Confucius. There is the Analects, which were written in 500 BC, the Doctrine of the Mean, which was written also in 500 BC, and the Great Learning, 500 BC. And I will give a just kind of a bit of a reading of what is going on here. This is the Great Learning by Confucius. What the Great Learning teaches is to illustrate illustrious virtue, to renovate the people, and to rest in the highest excellence. The point where to rest being known, the object of pursuit is then determined, and that being determined, a calm, unperturbedness may be attained to. To that calmness there will succeed a tranquil repose. In that repose there may be careful deliberation, and that deliberation will be followed by the attainment of the desired end. Things have their root and their branches. Affairs have their end and their beginning. To know what is first and what is last will lead near to what is taught in the Great Learning. The ancients who wished to illustrate illustrious virtue throughout the kingdom first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Such extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of things. Things being investigated, knowledge become complete. Their knowledge being complete, their thoughts were sincere. Their thoughts being sincere, their hearts were then rectified. Their hearts being rectified, their persons were cultivated. Their persons being cultivated, their families were regulated. Their families being regulated, their states were rightly governed. Their states being rightly governed, the whole kingdom was made tranquil and happy. From the Son of Heaven down to the mass of the people, all must consider the cultivation of the person the root of everything besides. It cannot be, when the root is neglected, that what should spring from it will be well ordered. It never has been the case of that what was of great importance has been slightly cared for, and at the same time that what was of slight importance has been greatly cared for. So these the Analects is a set of commentaries, a set of commentaries by the ancient scholars to kind of basically root out a balance. Chinese and Far Eastern philosophy is extremely different from Western philosophy in the sense that it wishes to maintain extreme bureaucratic control over the masses of people and to maintain a very strong balance. It is believed that everything can be harmonious if it is guided and rooted to a perfect order. Perhaps the Western equivalent of this is the feudal system or Plato's Republic. But, anyways, the hour is now over. The hour of the time is done, and this course of life in ancient China is now over with. So, I think that I have covered all of the Oriental cultures that were formed in these sort of river delta or river valleys through farming and cultivation and brick house building. So I can finally go back to the West. I can go back to Greece. Um, and how are you doing, Soulbreaker? Forge Gang! What's up, bro? How are you doing, man? So yeah, civilization did not start on the European continent. It started in the Near East. It definitely started in the Near East and the Mediterranean, with peripheral civilizations arising in Mesoamerica, China, and the Yellow River Valley in India, the Indus River Valley. But civilization would spread along the Silk Road. It would spread across the Mediterranean. And so I think that I've kind of gone a little bit beyond the scope of what this was initially supposed to be about. So I'm finished. I'll look at the chat. Ghost of Niccolo says Forge. Rick Perry says Forge Gang. Soulbreaker says CN and uses the heads, the giant stone heads of Easter Island. He says Breaking Bad. You know, I watched some of that television series. It's not too bad. But anyways, let's see here. Soulbreaker says too smart for me to understand. Well, I mean, I could break it down to make it easier. I mean, I was just reading about some of Confucius's works. Soulbreaker says Agre. Interesting. What does that mean, if I might ask? Just take a look at that. Oh, to gather into a mass, the sum or a whole. Okay. Soulbreaker says forge, and then Soulbreaker says civilization started in Mesopotamia. Yeah, it started roughly around the same time in Egypt and Mesopotamia. But Mesoamerica and the Andes, the Andean area, and China were their civilizations were formed largely isolated from Mesopotamia. Soulbreaker says agree. Okay, so thank you for watching. Thank you all for coming in and watching. This has been Life in Ancient and Imperial China. Thank you for watching and have a good day. Peace.